सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome back to World 360. If you're a regular viewer of this show, you know the drill. We're talking about 3 geopolitical topics that you probably didn't see in your daily news feed. Now, today's lineup includes what transpired in a phone call between the US Secretary of State and the Chinese Foreign Minister, Rishi Sunak's first test as UK Prime Minister, and 3, what has made Nigeria a hotbed of oil theft. So first up, the phone call between US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. Why is this phone call important? Well, it appears the point of this phone call was for both sides to engage in some form of communication and talk about where the bilateral relationship is going. As we know, US-China tensions are at a high, and the Ukraine war has only added salt to the fire. Usually, a phone call between these leaders indicates an attempt to thaw bilateral relations. But what we're going to look at today are the differences in how the Chinese government and the American government have described this phone call. And these differences are key because, like everything in diplomacy, there's always subtext. 2 things to remember before we start comparing. This is Wang Yi's first phone call with Blinken since he was promoted at the 20th Chinese Congress. Wang is now part of the Communist Party's Politburo, the top policy-making body, and his is an important name to remember as China's foreign policy evolves over the next few years. The second thing to remember is that this phone call comes 2 weeks before the G20 summit in Indonesia, where Joe Biden and Xi Jinping are likely to meet. Now let's look at the US State Department's description of the phone call between Blinken and Wang Yi. It's very short and it gets to the point. The main takeaway is that Blinken told Wang Yi to maintain open lines of communication and responsibly manage the US-China relationship. But if we look at Chinese state media, it says Wang Yi was a lot more aggressive with Blinken, a point that's missing from the US State Department's statement. Global Times, for example, claims Wang Yi told Blinken to stop targeting China by creating new obstacles for bilateral relations. It also mentions that Wang Yi raised the issue of US restrictions on Chinese exports and Chinese investment and called for these to be corrected. Now, this also wasn't mentioned in the US State Department's statement. Now, the restrictions Wang Yi could have been referring to are US trade sanctions in response to China's alleged mistreatment of ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So, why do these differences in statements from either side matter? Well, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace summed it up quite well in a report in February this year when it said that US-China relations are at a stalemate because of divergent framings of the bilateral relationship. Now, what this means is that there are fundamental differences in how both sides view each other. And at times, we see glimpses of this divergence in, say, how a phone call between leaders is reported by either side. Usually, countries which are on good terms put out press documents that are more or less consistent with one another. That's why it's important to pay attention to these small inconsistencies as they provide insight into deeper geopolitical dynamics. Let's also not forget that last week, Wang Yi met with the US ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, where Wang said both nations would not be able to change each other. That's also an indication of these fundamental differences between the US and China, which are hindering their larger bilateral relationship. Let's move on to our second topic, whether Rishi Sunak has just made his first mistake as UK Prime Minister. There has been global outrage against Rishi Sunak's decision not to attend the UN's annual climate conference, also known as COP27 this year. Rishi Sunak's defense has been that he has more pressing domestic commitments at hand, including prepping for a key economic statement due on November 17th. Now, he's been accused of showing indifference to global warming trends and not prioritizing the issue, as are other leaders like Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, who are expected to show up at this conference. The criticism against Rishi Sunak mounted when it was rumoured that even former UK PM Boris Johnson is likely to attend COP27, a man who has arguably flip-flopped on whether he believed in climate change at all. If Boris Johnson does show up to COP27 and Sunak doesn't, that won't be the best look either. What's also surprising is that some of the criticism against Sunak is coming from his own climate envoy, who also happens to be of Indian origin, Alok Sharma. On Saturday, Alok Sharma said he's pretty disappointed with Sunak's decision not to attend the conference and that it could risk undermining Britain's position as a world leader on climate change issues. Following all this criticism, reports are emerging that Rishi Sunak might in fact take a U-turn and end up attending the conference after all. Sources from Downing Street are now saying Sunak's attendance would depend on the progress of domestic issues. As we know, food prices in the UK have reached 40-year highs, and climbing energy prices are leaving families wondering if they will be able to warm their homes in the coming winter. So there are dire domestic issues in the UK, and Rishi Sunak's to go or not to go question is clearly polarizing the British public. Now let's look at what some UK newspapers had to say about this. In an editorial titled "Rishi Sunak has every right to skip COP27," The Telegraph took to criticizing the COP27 as a whole, almost suggesting that it is just a jamboree or a party and shouldn't be taken very seriously. Then again, it describes the COP27 issue as Rishi Sunak's first test as Prime Minister, because if he does end up doing a U-turn and attending the conference, he could end up looking politically weak. The Guardian, meanwhile, has called Rishi Sunak's decision shameful, especially at a time when, due to the Ukraine war, fossil fuel use is at a high. It also points out that Britain, of all countries, must attend COP27 because it was the first country to burn coal with the Industrial Revolution. Now, for our last topic of the day, we turn to the African nation of Nigeria, which is currently dealing with the aftermath of a 9-year oil theft. Now, this might be a lot to digest, and my first thoughts when reading about this was, 1, how do you steal oil from a pipeline? And 2, how do you keep it up for 9 years? And if this story couldn't get even more bizarre, Shell, a major oil firm, is allegedly involved in this too. First, we have to remember that Nigeria is the largest oil producer in Africa and the 6th largest exporter in the world. The Niger Delta is the source of the country's precious crude oil. However, poor governance and dirty politics has led many to conclude that Nigeria is but another example of the resource curse, the phenomenon where an abundance of natural resources seems to undermine democracy and lead to poor economic development. Russia is at times considered an example of this too, but perhaps more with regard to the democracy bit. Now, here's what happened in Nigeria. Earlier this month, Nigerian authorities found that one of the country's major arteries for crude oil transportation, known as the Trans-Forcados pipeline, had been compromised for nearly a decade. It was found that an illegal 4 km pipeline in Forcados, located at the tail end of the Trans-Forcados pipeline, was used to steal huge quantities undetected for 9 years. This means government and security accomplices were involved in the racket, as it was from this export terminal that cleaned crude oil would be siphoned off into ships and exported overseas. Now, what does Shell have to do with it? Well, it is suspected that the exit point of this illegally diverted crude was an oil field that is owned by a subsidiary of Shell. The controversy has forced Shell to launch its own investigation into the matter too. Now, the issue has sparked a nationwide debate in Nigeria about oil theft, and parliamentarians have come out with some figures about how rampant this issue is. Some have claimed that oil theft has deprived Nigeria of an estimated 7 lakh barrels of crude oil per day. Keep in mind that crude oil is Nigeria's main export, so this has a direct effect on the national income and government spending too. Now, the silver lining in all of this is that it is finally coming to light. The illegal connection line with the Trans-Forcados pipeline is just one of many. It might be surprising to hear, but the reason oil theft in Nigeria is coming to light now is because in August, the government hired a surveillance firm linked to a former militant leader, Tom Polo, to check the massive oil theft in the Niger Delta. Earlier, it was Tom Polo's firm that uncovered at least 58 other illegal oil pipelines. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint. Thank you so much for watching. Do keep sending in your suggestions.